Hello everyone, this is the Rambling Raconteur, and I'm back having just finished a late read of The Critic as Artist by Oscar Wilde, the great late 19th century aesthete, and thought I'd share some thoughts on it. It's an interesting book. I'd read a little bit of Oscar Wilde, a little bit of his plays, Importance of Being Earnest, passages from Salome, and I read The Picture of Dorian Gray about 18 years ago, 15 years ago. Right as I was getting out of high school, my senior year of high school, I read The Picture of Dorian Gray. That was my first introduction to Oscar Wilde. And so I had found this Viking portable volume. I love these anthologies. And the first work within it was this dialogue about Wilde. And so I thought I would kind of reintroduce myself to Wilde by reading that. And I just finished at the end of last year reading some of Edgar Allan Poe's criticism, and I thought, oh, this kind of is of a piece, criticism on poetry or on art and ideas in general, but would be a different change of pace. What I found with Wilde is what I had sort of suspected from the other pieces I'd read, which is the mountains are glorious and the deserts are vast. I believe that was originally said about the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon, but I think it's true of Wilde as well. He can be, at his best, very incisive and clever, and pack a little bit of wisdom and almost an aphoristic sense to his epigrams. But he is fundamentally epigrammatic. His ideas, I think, ultimately don't quite sustain perhaps the profundity and the depth that Wilde is going for. It's always hard to tell with Wilde how seriously you have to take any of his ideas, because he very much had a sense of being a public person and saying things almost for the sake of creating the attention, creating and cultivating the mystique of his clever aestheticism, rather than perhaps always believing everything that he was saying or writing. And that's not. I think we all are that way. He was just a very public individual who had crafted this persona that he wanted to cultivate and reinforce, I believe, through his publications. So The Critic as Artist is a dialogue. Of course, the dialogue form is 2,400 years old. It goes back to some of our earliest extant writings as humans with the dialogues of Plato. And Wilde was a classical scholar. When he went to Oxford, he wrote extensively on and studied extensively with those classical writers. He was very much aware of Plato and Plato's use of the dialogue, both artistically and also philosophically. Wilde is not really part of the tradition of the French encyclopedists and the Enlightenment, but there again is where we saw sort of a resurgence in the dialogue, especially with Denis Diderot. He wrote a number of dialogues, Rameau's Nephew, D'Alembert's Dream, and so Wilde's dialogue is sort of a piece with those. It is stylistically inspired by them. If you're thinking outside of literature for dialogues, the one that springs to mind, especially as I was reading The Critic as Artist by Wilde, the one that springs to mind is the film My Dinner with Andre by Louis Malle from, I believe, the 1980s, where two characters sit down and have dinner, and one of them continues to just expound on his ideas around art and philosophy and life and existence and how they're all intertwined. And the other character is sort of sitting there eating dinner and continually probing and asking, well, can you really mean that? Like, that sounds fascinating. Tell me more about that. And so Wilde has two characters, Ernest and Gilbert. This is not Ernest from The Importance of Being Earnest. And the Gilbert character sort of acts as Wilde. He's going to propose all of these fantastic ideas around why criticism is important, why art is important, and so many different theories. The Ernest character continually sort of presses Gilbert. He'll try to come up with examples around, well, you said this, but I think the Greeks exemplify this. They continually return to the Greeks as exemplifying either the start of art or the start of criticism or the start of sort of aesthetic philosophy, all stemming from that, as personifying the idea of is creative work or critical work, is that stemming from one individual or is it representative of an entire culture? That being a question that Wilde writes about. And I would say ultimately the work does not push our thinking in a way that would warrant a reread. As I'd said, that the mountains are high, but the deserts are vast. There are some fantastic passages, some fantastic ideas embedded within the text. It's about 100 pages, 90 pages as a dialogue. However, it's probably not a work I'll reread anytime soon. Someone who is interested in Oscar Wilde or in criticism or aestheticism, certainly it's worth the read. It's not an exhaustive text, but I think Wilde pushes towards some ideas that, whether or not he believes in them, I don't think that even his explanations of them are ultimately tenable. He certainly seems to overvalue literature specifically and poetry as sort of the highest art, suggesting that music, painting, sculpture, particularly sculpture, do not create sustained effects. He pushes at the idea that critics are greater than artists, that it's more important to be able to interpret great art for other people than it is to create great art for those people to encounter. And he's of course a fantastic artist who's celebrated, but he's also pushing this idea of criticism. And I don't want to characterize his opinions as self-serving. I don't necessarily think that's what it is. I think, though, that Wilde would sometimes push ideas that he didn't necessarily believe or agree with in order to sort of just stir the pot a little bit and keep the Wilde persona, keep it moving, keep it spinning there in the air. There are, though, some quite lovely and thought-provoking passages. One is, we are sometimes apt to think that the voices that sounded at the dawn of poetry were simpler, more natural, and fresher than ours, and that the world which the early poets looked at and through which they walked had a kind of poetical quality of its own, and almost without changing could pass into song. The snow lies thick now upon Olympus, and its steep, scarped sides are bleak and barren. But once we fancy the white feet of the Muses brushed the dew from the anemones. In the morning and at evening Apollo came to sing to the shepherds of the vale. But in this we are merely lending to other ages what we desire or think we desire for our own. The work that seems to us to be the most natural and simple product of its time is always the product of the most self-conscious effort. And so he certainly raises a great idea there, which is that we continually want to aspire to return to some natural, beautiful time where humans were closer to nature, were closer to beauty, where we just seemed to be like in a resonant frequency with it, and could therefore just turn a daily walk suddenly blossomed into song. And I think Wilde is pushing at the idea that you have to seek out beauty. You have to almost make a demand to discover it, especially from a creative aspect. That people aren't necessarily born as creative people, but that continually, by exercising those aspects of our mind and of what drives our desires, we can become that. He has some ideas around how through education you want to expose younger children to art and beauty, so that they can grow to appreciate it at a much more rooted way than perhaps we always do. Another idea is a Wilde on his own London society. Mediocrity weighing mediocrity in the balance, and ignorance applauding its brother. That's how he characterizes the journalism and criticism of his time. He says at another point, to know the vintage and quality of a wine, one need not drink the whole cask. And he's saying you don't have to read the entire book to know whether or not you appreciate it. And that could perhaps be applied to his own critic as artist dialogue, that you don't have to read the whole thing to appreciate that it's flawed in many ways. But there are some very witty comments, and there are some comments that strike quite deeply. Wilde is never one to hit you with a hammer when he writes. It's always a needle, and sometimes it punctures deep, and at other times it glances off, and the needle breaks. And again, it's not a work that I'll likely reread, but if you were interested in those types of writing, it's certainly one to explore. If you've read Aristotle's Poetics or even Nicomachean Ethics, or also, I would even say the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. The entire second half of the dialogue takes place after they've had dinner. They start in the afternoon. These two characters talk for a while, mostly Gilbert talking and Ernest periodically questioning him. And then they have dinner, and they eat ortolan, deep fried, caged songbird, as horrifying as we can get, but as aesthetic as we can get, according to Wilde. They dine on ortolan, and then they continue their discussion into night, and right as the dialogue ends, day breaks, and dawn begins. But the entire second half of the dialogue is all around the idea that the critic shouldn't be trying to create, shouldn't be trying to take action or do anything, but should be doing nothing. And it's not at all in the philosophical sense of Lao Tzu, where there's a purpose in action. There's a purposeful inaction, but it's rather almost that it takes more discipline to do nothing. And so Wilde thinks that aesthetics shouldn't be wasting their time with action. They should be conserving their energy for criticism and making those choices. The other piece that it goes along with, of course, is Aristotle with his Nicomachean Ethics, and there's a clear intertextuality there where Wilde is sort of referencing the concept of the contemplative life and those who are blessed or noble enough to lead it. He being one of these individuals, like Aristotle. It's so fantastic when people write about how their group are just leading the most wonderful life, and it's a shame others can't. But those are some texts that if you've appreciated those, this might be something that challenges your perspective a little bit, while also being of a piece in the continuum of literature with them. So that's The Critic as Artist by Oscar Wilde. Give it a shot if you're really curious. Otherwise, just look up some Oscar Wilde quotes and aphorisms. It's very much of a piece with those. So thank you, BookTube. I'll hope to be back soon. Good night.